On June 6, 1996, a woman named Darlie Routier called 911 screaming that she and her sons had been attacked. When emergency workers arrived on scene, 6-year-old Devin Routier was already deceased from 2 deep wounds to his chest. 5-year-old Damon Routier had 4 wounds to his back and was unresponsive. Paramedics put him in the ambulance and performed all the life-saving measures that they could while taking him to Baylor Hospital in Dallas, Texas. Unfortunately, all their efforts could not bring little Damon back, and he was pronounced deceased at 3:26 a.m., which was roughly an hour after that 911 call came in. Darlie was also brought to the hospital. She had a wound that appeared to be serious to her throat and was taken into surgery immediately. Investigators were on the scene at the home trying to answer the questions of who could do this to these small children and their mother. Was it an intruder, or could it have been somewhere much closer to the situation? This case and the twists and turns have people very divided, and when a case involves young children, emotions tend to run very high. This is a tangled web that we will try and unweave today as we discuss the case of Darlie. It's going to be a very long one, even with me dividing it into 2 parts, but the details need to be detailed for this highly argued and controversial case. So grab a snack for yourself and a comfy blanket. My name is Misty Sims, and this is Beyond Reasonable Doubt. Let's dive right in. Now, before we dive in, I do want to say this case is highly debated and controversial for those in support of Darlie and for those against her. You are definitely going to be left feeling certain ways today, and I'm trying to present all the facts from both sides as much as possible. But if you know more or additional details that I may have not covered, you are absolutely welcome to leave those in the comments, as well as your thoughts and opinions. But please do so respectfully to one another, especially if your opinions differ. Alright, now let's go. Darlie Lynn Peck was born on January 4th, 1970 to her parents, Darlie and Larry, in Altoona, Pennsylvania. And the family would move and settle in Lubbock, Texas when she was about 13. And sadly, her parents would eventually divorce, with her dad going back to Pennsylvania. And Darlie's mom would move on into a new relationship with another man, and she'd have 2 more daughters with him named Danielle and Dana. Now, Darlie, the daughter, was 12 and 10 years older than these girls, so she kind of became a mother figure to them. And friends and family described her as just sweet, thoughtful, very generous. They said she loved to give gifts, give charity, and you could almost always find Darlie volunteering at school or helping with classroom parties. Well, on Mother's Day of 1985, when Darlie was just 15, her mother introduced her to the man that would become Darlie's future husband, Darren Routier. Darren was 17 at the time, and he worked at the Western Sizzler Steakhouse where Darlie's mom worked. He was the assistant manager, and he was actually Darlie's mother's boss at the time. And Darren was described as being handsome, tall, had a lot of girlfriends. He was a go-getter. I mean, he had started working at that steakhouse as a dishwasher at 14, and by the time he turned 18, he was the manager. And he also lettered in 3 sports, including football, so probably thought of as a real catch to some. And Darlie's friends, well, they described her as quite a catch too because of just how pretty Darlie was. Darlie's best friend said that men stared at her all the time. So no doubt that Darren was caught by her quickly and also proud to have her on his arm. They were immediately inseparable and would move in together before Darlie was even 18 years old. Now, there's a lot of chatter on them living together, being intimate prior to her turning of age, but in Texas, it's a state that has Romeo and Juliet provisions, or at least did at this time. And that allows a couple to be intimate if they're within a 3-year age gap from one another. So regardless of how we may feel about it personally, they weren't breaking any laws. Well, while Darlie was still finishing up in high school, Darren took her on a ski trip to Colorado, where he got down on one knee and proposed, and Darlie happily accepted. Now, once she was 18, the couple moved to Dallas because Darren wanted to go to school there and earn a degree in electronics from a tech school, which he would later use to provide for their family and his soon-to-be wife, of course. Darren and Darlie would marry in a small ceremony outside of his parents' home in August of 1988. He took a big honeymoon to Jamaica, and then they settled into a cute little apartment in Garland, Texas. And both started working at a company called Qplex, which was a circuit board manufacturer, so that's that degree being put to use. And Darren would eventually go on to start his own side hustle called NCMEC, which tested circuit boards, and he ran this out of a room in their home, in the little apartment. Well, by June of 1989, they moved to an upscale lakefront subdivision in Roulette, Texas. Now, that's a suburb of Dallas and is considered very upscale, very nice. Well, 2 days after they moved in, the couple was overjoyed as they welcomed their first son, Devin, and just a short time later, they welcomed their second son, Damon. So, just like the American dream, right? Starting our own business, having a house, having 2 kids. Well, Darren kept working that side hustle that whole time, and by 1992, he was able to quit Qplex and take his business full-time into like an official office. Darren has acknowledged that it was risky, but that he needed to bring in some more income because their family was growing, and the lifestyle they were starting to enjoy, including upgrading their home in that same subdivision onto a corner lot, was costly, right? Well, Darlie took on the role of bookkeeper for NCMEC, so she's left Qplex as well. And then when they welcomed their third son, Drake, in October of 1995, she took a little step back. Now, she'd go in every so often to check on things, but she didn't have to be there all the time. And part of this was because, she had her younger sister, Dana, working there, and her best friend, Barbara Jo Vale. So I would guess that made her feel a little at ease stepping back and, taking care of the kids. Well, at this time, too, Darren is bringing in some money. He was grossing over $200,000, which would be close to $500,000 today. So they're doing really well, and Darlie's loving his new plus-up. And according to her friend Barbara Jo, she said that Darlie was really spending some money around this time. She's buying clothes, furs, jewelry, decorating their house extravagantly. They're taking trips all over the place. She said that it looked like Darlie was spending a lot on herself, but it was a little worrisome because she didn't see a lot going back into the business. And of course, that's problematic if you want a business to sustain itself and thrive. But it wasn't just Darlie that was spending. Darren wasn't shy about it either. He was driving around in a 1986 Jaguar that he paid cash for. He collected a lot of pricey sports memorabilia. He bought a boat. He loved jewelry, wore a whole lot of that. And it was said that Darren loved and was real proud of their home and their lifestyle they built for themselves. Their home had a hot tub, a bar, a wine rack, a karaoke system. It was the party place. In fact, the neighborhood kids actually called their house the Nintendo house because the Routier kids had all sorts of fun toys and game systems, and they also dressed to the nines. Now, Devin, he loved jewelry just like his dad. He always wore a watch and a necklace and was considered the jokester of the family. And Damon was a smart little boy who loved to swim, and they were just super close to each other, loved to play with each other and all the other neighborhood kids. But by the end of 1995, start of 96, business is slowing down for Darren, if not just halted completely. They're receiving letters from their mortgage company threatening foreclosure after they had fallen a couple months behind on their mortgage payments. And they were also $12,000 in credit card debt, struggling to make minimum payments, and also owed $10,000 in back taxes, and the IRS is coming for you. Well, Darren, he could no longer pay the rent for his office space, and he even made a comment to Barbara when he gave her paycheck during this time and said, well, you're the only one getting paid now. Now, Darren's going to go on later to testify in court that they only had about $64 in their personal account around this time, but he says that wasn't a big deal. It was only because he hadn't paid himself yet. And he would have done so on June the 7th and claimed he had been making around $111,000 in that first 6 months of the business year. Now, keep that nugget for part 2 because the prosecutors are going to refute that in the trial and claim that the business was actually losing money. So during all this, financial discomfort, Darlie's whole demeanor changes. She's very argumentative with Darren, and it's always typically over money, and she'd even come in the office and start throwing things at him. But she didn't stop shopping. And she even hired people to help her around the house. Now, her best friend was getting worried about her. She saw the state of mind she was in, and something ain't right with Darlie, the way she's acting. She's never been this argumentative before. She brought it up to Darren and said that she thought Darlie should see a doctor. And Barbara said that Darren seemed to blow it off. He's like, we're going to take a 2-week trip to Pennsylvania, and then Darlie's going to Cancun with a friend for a little R&R. So he's basically downplaying what Barbara feels like is a very serious issue with Darlie. Being, an unattended husband aside, where were they getting the money to go on these trips if they're strapped for cash? You're probably asking yourself that, because I did. Well, they tried to get it from the bank, but it didn't go quite as planned. On June 1st, 1996, Darren applied for a $5,000 loan, and he was denied on June 3rd. Now, I would assume that is because of the picture of their current financials and those back taxes and all that painted for the bank, right? Well, Darlie was keeping a journal during this time, and depression could definitely, in my unprofessional opinion, be seen creeping in. When the journal started, she was currently pregnant with the couple's third child, the baby Drake, and she wrote a lot about worrying about giving birth after not having done so in 5 years, as well as, about her mom and her mom's husband, Denny. She wrote about not knowing why Denny had done what he did to her, but hoped that he would ask for forgiveness from God. And she never elaborated on what she meant there, but it sounds bad, right? And she also wrote about her two boys, Damon and Devin, and just loving them and wanting God to watch over them. And Darlie was noted to not be a huge churchgoer, but her journal does seem to show some spiritualness from within, and maybe she's looking for help with her depression, through her writing and her praying. And she even wrote that everything hurt, and she felt like something was missing, even though she just really loved Darren with all her heart. She said she longed to feel young again and have fun. And to be fair, she was a very young wife and mother, and I think a lot of people would feel that way inside. And this journal was supposed to be private. It was not supposed to be read out loud. I was not supposed to know about it. You were not supposed to know about it. So while it feels like foreshadowing based on what we know has happened, it could also have just been kind of a form of self-healing and expression that people find when they journal, myself included. So who knows, right? Well, Darlie would go on to give birth to baby Drake, and roughly 5 months after his birth, in March of 96, she completely stopped breastfeeding him and started taking some pretty extreme diet pills to regain her figure, including Fen-Phen, which has been taken off the market here in the U.S. due to several things, but a large and very common one being Fen rage. And she lost all the weight by May and claimed the pills didn't make her feel any different emotionally that she was aware of, but many people said that she was very upset about her weight gain. And even though it wasn't much, she went from a 4 to a 6 or an 8. Somebody please give me an 8 again, okay? I'll take it. But Darren even admitted that her figure was very important to him, and even admitted to paying for her implants after the first 2 kids. So there's definite pressure from Darlie to maintain her appearance, and it sounds like it's not just her pressure, but it's also coming from Darren, which to me is just kind of hateful after she's birthed his 3 kids by this point, but whatever, Darren. Now, all this seems to play into the journal entries that she wrote that began, she started talking about baby Drake after he was born, and then she wanted to be a good example for him, and even hinted at a little trouble in her marriage, asking God to put his hand on their marriage. She wrote more about Devin and Damon, and if they were growing up too fast and needed to be taught the difference between right and wrong. And then she ended with a letter that would be called a suicide note at trial to the boys, asking them to forgive her for what she was going to do, and that their dad would take care of them. But the letter abruptly stops. Now, Darlie said on record that she did feel bad during this time, was crying a lot, but she did not make an attempt on her life. She said that she thought about taking some sleeping pills, and then, Darren even came home when she called him to tell him how upset she was. They cried together, but just right around this time, she's got her menstrual cycle, which she hadn't had in over a year after having the baby, and that kind of just cleared everything up and made it better. Well, Barbara, the best friend, said that Darren told a completely different story to her, and said that Darlie had actually stopped writing that day when Darren walked in on her. She hid the note so he wouldn't see it, and she said that Darlie had unwrapped all the pills and was going to take them, but Darren found out about the pills when their little dog Domino drug the packaging out from where it was hidden. Now, Barbara said that she told Darlie at that point, you need to seek treatment. And at first, Darlie said, I'm going to go, I'll leave the kids with Darren's mom, and I'm going to go to a treatment facility. But she quickly changed her mind and said that she was worried that her mother-in-law would try to take the kids away. Now, this is going to be very counter to the relationship that her mother-in-law would paint for the public once this case broke, saying that Darlie was just this wonderful person, the kind of daughter-in-law every mother would want. So, who knows? And then we got Darren's account of the situation. So, account number 3. And it was different from Darlie and Barbara's, saying that he never read her private journal entry. He just said he found her crying in bed, writing, and she told him that he needed to spend more time with the kids. He knew she had sleeping pills, but never thought that she would take the pills as an attempt on her own life. And he backed up her story about them crying together and then her getting her cycle, which had been absent for that year, and things went back to normal. So, you know, hang with me here, because this is just the start of the mismatched stories in the tangled web, okay? So on June 5th, Barbara came over to the Routier home around 5:15 p.m. to pick up her mother, Helena, who cleaned for the Routiers in their home. And there was another female employee of the Routiers named Rebecca in the home who was supposed to be serving as baby Drake's nanny. Now, Helena would go on record that when she arrived that day, she asked Rebecca where baby Drake was. And Rebecca pointed to Darlie and a kind of like a bundle that was like really oddly laying on her lap. Well, Helena realized that she had to mean that baby Drake was in that bundle, so she asked Darlie to give her the baby, and Darlie said, no, Drake likes to be held this way. So Helena asks again, Darlie hands him over and just goes upstairs. Helena she took the baby, she starts unwrapping these blankets off of him because one is directly covering his face. Helena said that she noticed that he was super sweaty, he was red, and his lips were starting to discolor. And she said that he went like kind of gasped for, getting his breath again, and then he started to cry. So, whew. Helena went on to say that she saved him from harm multiple times that day, including him almost hitting the glass top coffee table with his head, and again when he almost fell out of his high chair, and that Darlie and Rebecca just laughed and carried on with their day. So, I do want to say that these statements were ones that Helena gave at a hearing, but not to the jury, because the judge ruled them to be prejudicial and unrelated to the murders. But I think they're still important to give us a better idea and a picture of possibly Darlie's mindset on that day. Helena said she went ahead and did the laundry, she dusted, and she vacuumed that day, and she put the vacuum in the kitchen between the wine rack and the pantry. Helena said Darlie called her over and wanted her to look at some jewelry, and then tried to get her to buy it for $10,000. Now, Helena, I assume, didn't just have this kind of money, so they just left it on the kitchen counter and, walked away. It doesn't really seem plausible to me that Helena would have just had an extra $10,000 in her pocket, but I guess Darlie could have been just kind of desperate and hoping, based on their financial troubles. And it was said that Darren had also come home during this time and was organizing items out in the garage for a garage sale. So it feels like they were trying to look for ways to make some kind of quick money. And Barbara said when she came inside to get her mom, Darlie was obviously upset. She's kind of pacing between rooms. And Barbara said the atmosphere was just so uncomfortable that she and her mom left about 30 minutes later. And Darlie has said that this was taken a little out of context. Apparently there were some claims made at some point that she and Darren had an argument, and that was not true. That was blown completely out of proportion, because she said what had happened was she was so uncomfortable because of a phone conversation she had with a man who had cursed her out, and then the neighborhood kids are running in and out of the house adding to the chaos, so she was just very flustered. Darlie was also upset too because Darren had apparently been taking her vehicle because his Jaguar had broken down. And then their boat was also broken down, and he wasn't really doing anything about it. And most wives were like, what the heck, right? Get on that honey-do list. So this was a whole lot of stress, and then let's also remember that the house was in potential foreclosure or headed that way. So all that's probably in the back of her mind too. So this next part, I'm going to give you two accounts. One's going to be a 911 call, and the other will be what the first officer arriving on scene has described. So bear with me and hang with me on these parallel accounts, okay? So on June 6th at 2:30 a.m., Darlie called 911 screaming that someone had broken in and had stabbed her and her children. When the operator asked who it was, Darlie just keeps saying her little boy is dying. The operator has already dispatched the ambulance 23 seconds into the call, and they're on their way. By 40 seconds in, you can hear Darren in the background, but you can't make out what he says until over a minute in. The operator continues to try to get her to talk, and Darlie is just talking to Darren and screaming that her babies are dying. At 2 minutes and 53 seconds, Darlie says she thinks she is dying. At 3 minutes and 45 seconds, you can hear an officer talking, and Darlie tells him that there was a knife. And the operator says, don't touch it. Do not touch it. but Darlie said she already has. By 4 minutes in, the operator tells her to let in another officer who has arrived on scene now. By 5 minutes in, she has to tell her again. At that point, we can start to hear the officer's voice as well, so she's let him in by this point. At 5 minutes and 4 seconds, again, Darlie says that she did touch the knife and is lying over there, and then says, "Oh God, if we could have gotten the prints, just maybe." And then the call ends after about 5.5 minutes with the operator. And the operator, she didn't hang up until she confirmed those officers were there and let inside. Now, I'm not going to play the call because it's loud. There's a lot of screaming. It's been played a lot. So it's kind of up there with the Chad Dorman case and that body cam footage. And a lot of people have seen it or they don't want to. But you can Google it and find it pretty easily for yourself if you want to hear it. I will point out that the operator did not ask her to give CPR, and Darlie gave an excuse or a reason why there weren't prints on that weapon and why her prints were on it. So this is going to come up at trial again, so that's kind of why I'm like highlighting that. Now, Officer David Waddell was the first one to arrive on the scene, so this is his account. He arrived at 2:32 a.m. while Darlie was still on the phone with that 911 operator and had his weapon drawn, and says he didn't see anybody running, like, on foot running away, or a car that's speeding away, nothing, nada. He actually didn't see anything unusual or sus, honestly. He said that Darren walked out on the front porch and told him that his children had been attacked inside. Waddell followed Darren inside and said that Darren walked over to Devin, and Darlie was standing kind of near the kitchen counter, like a few feet away, and she had a towel to her neck, the phone in her hand, and she's obviously visibly upset. She's screaming and she's yelling about her babies, and Waddell asked her, he said, "Who attacked them?" Darlie replies to him that she didn't know, but that they were still in the garage, and pointed in that general direction. Waddell told Darren to apply pressure to Devin's wounds, and Darren tried by getting down on his knees, and he's either performing CPR or holding pressure, but he said it wasn't working because air was coming out of Devin's chest. Now, Waddell also told Darlie to get a towel and hold it to Damon's back to try to stop the bleeding. And Darlie did not move and just repeated the attacker was still in the garage. Now, this can kind of be heard on that 911 call too. Well, Waddell's saying hey, you got to get a rag. Darlie's just saying they killed our babies. It's very chaotic. Officer Waddell tried to look into the garage, but it was dark, so he's waiting for backup because he thinks that the suspect is still in there in the house at this point, and he knew he needed to wait for help and then make sure that he was protecting the family. That is the utmost important thing, right? Well, Darlie and Darren have been very critical of the officer and him not providing medical assistance to the boys, but Waddell would go on record and say that the officers are trained to clear the home first before providing any medical assistance to victims. Medical assistance is second, and then preserving the crime scene is third. So Waddell said he kept his weapon drawn. He kind of positioned himself between the family and the garage door, and that was pretty much the only way for somebody to get back into the house. So he asked what the man looked like, and Darlie said she couldn't say if he was white or black, but he was wearing a white shirt, dark pants, and a baseball cap. So, she said that they kind of just fought for a minute at the end of the bar, and of course we're all injured. Waddell said Damon's lying on the floor on his stomach, on his left side of his face, and is looking at the officer and Darlie. And Waddell said he thought it looked like he was trying to breathe, but he didn't go and take a pulse or anything like that. It's just what he thought. Waddell said he, again at this point, told Darlie to get a towel to try to stop the bleeding, and Darlie just stood there. Waddell said that Darlie told him that she chased the intruder who dropped that knife, and she picked it up and she put it on the counter, messing up, any of the prints that could have possibly been on that handle. Now, by this point, Sergeant Matthew Walling was the next to enter the home, and that was that second officer that we heard on the 911 call just before it ended. And Waddell and Walling, now they're together. They're going to try to go and, search that garage. They see, blood on the floor. There's a broken wine glass. They're kind of being careful walking over everything not to disturb it. And they went into the utility room, and then one of them went out into the garage. But there was nobody in there. So if the suspect had run in there, he was gone now. So officers come back into the main part of the house, and Darlie is still standing there near the counter with no towel on Damon. 2 paramedics, they arrive about this time, and the officers told Darren and Darlie, get back, go stand by these sliding glass doors that kind of led into the backyard. And the officers went to clear the upstairs area and kind of check, make sure nobody had run up there and tried to hide. And they get the shock and a little bit surprised when they find baby Drake in his crib, because they didn't know that he was up there. No one had mentioned him. Well, they leave him in his crib because they're still looking for that intruder, right? They go back downstairs, and Sergeant Walling says that Darlie starts giving him an account, and she tells him that she was asleep on the couch and woke up to realize that there was someone standing over her. And then she realized that she had been stabbed and began struggling with that person on the couch. Now, they struggled before running through the kitchen towards the garage. She now says he was a white male wearing a dark ball cap, black shirt, and blue jeans. So her story did, kind of change slightly, but she could have also been recalling more now, but she's, I don't want to say calming down, but, trying to keep a level head. Now, their house is kind of open concept downstairs with an island and bar stool separating the family room and the kitchen. And the utility room was off the kitchen and it led into the garage. Paramedic Jack Colby was on the scene, and he described Darren as almost more excited than distraught. And he said he found Damon laying face down wearing a black t-shirt. He examined his back for injuries, and then he rolled him over, and there was no towel on top of him. Now, Colby then noticed that his eyes were open, and he said he thought he saw like a little glimmer of light in his eyes, but then he took a gasp for air and that light went out. And he said he didn't take a pulse, but he did start CPR, and when it wasn't working, he picked him up and he took him to the ambulance where there was all sorts of life support equipment. Now, Colby said that Damon was not bleeding at this point, so that could have also been, an indicator that maybe his heart had stopped. But in the ambulance, the paramedic team, they intubated Damon and they started an IV in his jugular vein. And they also administered epinephrine. Probably really hammered that pronunciation, sorry. But Damon didn't have any response to it. So they headed to Baylor Hospital, but he was officially pronounced deceased on arrival at 3:26 a.m. by Dr. Alejandro Santos. Colby's partner, Brian Koscheck, had gone to Devin while Colby was focused on Damon. When Devin was lying on his back with no shirt on and didn't have a pulse, his eyes were open, and the paramedic was quoted as saying that he looked like he still had a surprise or a help me look frozen on his face. When Koscheck realized he could not help Devin, he went to check on Darlie, who was kneeling by the counter with that towel to her neck. Now, she was upset, but she wasn't crying or screaming at this point, and she wasn't showing any signs of shock, so he took her outside of the porch and he dressed her neck and her arm, and it had also been injured. And while he was doing her neck, he inadvertently caught her gold chain in that bandage. I mean, she was completely covered in blood, and she was injured and had been through all this. So they're like, get in the ambulance. We need to take you to the hospital. So they transport her to Baylor Hospital as well. Well, they take her blood pressure in the ambulance, and it was 140/80. And ideal is usually described as 120/80. But, they expected it honestly to be low since she would have lost a lot of blood in the attack. But, of course, doctors are going to, weigh in on all that later. So keep that in your back pocket. Now, paramedic Koscheck stayed to check on Darren and baby Drake. Both were unharmed. And Koscheck got baby Drake out of his crib, brought him downstairs, and a neighbor named Karen took him with her to take care of him. And I'm sure just, get him out of the chaos. And Karen was also allowed to go inside and get the little dog Domino that we talked about earlier. He was a Pomeranian, and he had yet to stop barking. So you can actually even hear Domino on the 911 tape if you choose to listen to it. So after getting, Drake and Domino out of, this situation and with Karen, paramedic Koscheck called in a chaplain to assist with anyone on this scene, because bless their hearts walking in on this. This scene would have to absolutely haunt you in your dreams with those poor little boys and just seeing that. So, he said that it was like none he had ever seen before, and it was extremely hard to deal with him, so I can only imagine what it did to the others. And Officer Waddell has backed up Koscheck's account by saying that, he had put up police tape to seal off the scene, and he had to move it when the paramedics arrived, and he stood guard at the door, while they were, in there, not letting anybody else in or out. And Waddell said that he saw Koscheck bring out baby Drake to Karen. He did allow her to go inside to get Domino, but just as Koscheck said, she did not she didn't disturb the crime scene. She went through the front door and didn't go into the family room or the kitchen. Now, Waddell said that he was relieved at 3 a.m. by another officer, but he and one of the canine officers actually still went and searched the neighborhood, but they didn't really find anything suspicious. None of the neighbors really saw anything that stood out outside of like a few cars that they didn't know. Well, meanwhile, we've got detectives that are now assigned to the case, and it's Detective Jimmy Patterson and Detective Chris Frosch. Now, while they were seasoned enough to take on a case like this, they knew that they could probably use an expert on the crime scene. So they called in James Cron as a consultant, and he was recently retired after 29 years with the Dallas Sheriff's Department, and he had investigated over 21,000 crime scenes by this point. So, guy knows his stuff, we would think, right? Like he's got to be pretty spot on. And then they also requested assistance from Richardson Police Physical Evidence Supervisor Jeff Craig, who helped obtain the blood evidence from the kitchen and a lot of other areas. Now, Cron arrived around 5:45 a.m. and said the only thing out of the ordinary in the family room was there was a lot of blood on the carpet, and of course the body of the deceased child, which had been led for investigators since he was pronounced deceased on the scene. Now, Cron said the coffee table was like maybe by the couch, was like a little misaligned or ajar, but the flower arrangement on top was still sitting on the glass and upright. Technicians did not move anything before Cron entered, and Cron said it did not appear that there had been a struggle like you would think. A lampshade had been knocked off, but that was later admitted to be one of the paramedics doing, just while they were working, the scene. It was an accident, and there was no blood on it. And when Cron went into the kitchen area, there was blood and like broken glass from the wine glass, and then that vacuum that we talked about earlier was tipped over on the floor. He asked somebody to take a picture of Darlie's feet, but she didn't have any cuts on the bottoms of her feet, which I guess Cron found strange because her footprints were in there and from the blood on the floor. And on the edge of the counter, that's where they found that bloody butcher knife and a few drops of blood on the floor of the utility room. But again, not really enough to believe that like this massacring weapon had just been like dropped there, in the run on the way out. There was also blood on the door from the utility room to the garage with partial prints, but because they were partial, they couldn't match them. And the window in the garage was open and the screen was cut, but there was no like blood anywhere in the garage. And it was described as very cluttered and it having a very tight path on the way to the window. So you would have expected if like this intruder's in this frenzy and he's running out that he would have knocked over boxes, or there was a litter box in front of the window. The only thing they saw was a small smear of blood on the floor, and that was determined to be left by a crime scene tech after Cron had it analyzed and matched it to the tech's boot. So there was nothing that really led anyone to believe that somebody had left through that path and out the window. The mulch outside was undisturbed. There weren't really signs of forced entry outside that cut on the screen. The outside gate was shut and latched from the inside. So Cron said at that point he didn't believe that an intruder had went into that home. So he started like a dual investigation. He was still considering an intruder, but also considering could it have been somebody inside the home. He went inside and he moved that vacuum that had already been photographed by this point and was careful not to touch the blood on the handle. And underneath were marks that looked like roll marks and blood on the wheels. And then he examined that broken glass further and he noticed that the glass was just sitting on top of those bloody footprints, but there was no blood on the actual glass. And this glass was from a wine glass in that wine rack, but there was no blood on the rack and no blood on the bottles. And Cron started like bumping into it, rattling it, like kind of just all these things, trying to see if he could get glasses to fall off, and he couldn't. So it looked to him like somebody may have deliberately smashed that glass on the floor. There were no bloody bare footprints leading, from the living room or back from the utility room. There were prints by the sink. And Cron also looked at the couch where like Darlie had been sleeping, and there were no cuts or defects to like the pillow and the bedding. And he said just honestly not as much blood as he would have expected to see. Now there were 2 latent prints on that glass top coffee table we've talked quite a bit about, but they weren't full enough that they could really make a match. But Cron said they looked like they might have been from, like a small child or a juvenile. So, he's questioning what he's seeing at this point. Now, as I said, Darlie had been transported to the hospital as well, and she arrived a little after 3:30 a.m. And a nurse would go on record saying that prior to getting Darlie into surgery, she kept yelling either like she needed pain medicine or she's asking, why they killed her babies, kind of like alternating between these statements. And one of the attending doctors named Patrick Dillon would go on record saying that he had asked Darlie what had happened, and she said she was stabbed by a white man in a baseball cap, but she only saw him from the back, which is different than what she described with him standing over her. Well, Dr. Santos, who had, pronounced the other son dead, decided that they needed to take her into the OR and do some exploratory surgery just to be safe and sorry, because this wound is to her neck and her throat. Once inside, that's when they could see that the wound was about 3.5 inches long, and it extended to but did not cut through the carotid sheath, which covers the carotid artery. It only nicked the platysma muscle and no strap muscle. So in layman's terms, thank God, it was a superficial wound. So they irrigated it and they stitched it up. Now, medical examiner Dr. Townsend Parchman would later testify that the kind of the details of this injury, and he says you have like a lot of long, thin muscles lying over the neck, and it didn't get any of those. It got rather what he referred to as little bleeders. Now, he did say it was about 2 millimeters from cutting the carotid artery, and if that had been good, it didn't matter what she was going to hold pressure to or with or whatever, she would have bled out within just a couple minutes. But he also said that the wound to her arm was not a stab wound. Dr. Santos, who did the surgery, would testify that it cut through the skin and the fat, but it didn't penetrate any of the muscle below. So he called it a laceration. And when they removed the bandages, from her neck prior to surgery, that was when they found that chain caught in there, and they removed it and they collected it for evidence. So remember that for part 2. Now, the cut on her arm was given a couple of stitches, even though it kind of stopped bleeding by this point. And then she also had a superficial cut to her shoulder, which didn't require any stitches. They just used the steri strips on it. But they still sent her to the ICU around 5 a.m. Dr. Santos was just worried. He was worried about how she was going to react when she learned, the fate of her children. All this media attention is going to be going on, and, not so much because of her injuries, but more, I guess, her mental state, right? Now, Darlie gave a whole lot of statements to the nurses and doctors that were unsolicited. One nurse saying that she, Darlie was crying and asking how anyone could do this, but then would also kind of go on to talk about picking up that knife again, worrying about the fingerprints and messing up fingerprints on it. And then she started asking for pain medication again. She was rating her pain like a 3 out of 5. So the nurse just gave her a little bit of Demerol and some Phenergan because he knew police were about to come in and want to question her. They've been waiting. Well, at 6 a.m., those 2 detectives, Patterson and Frosch, they come in and they ask to speak to her and they want to photograph her wounds. They asked her if she felt well enough to talk to them, and she said she did. And she told them that she awoke to find the intruder over her and saw the knife. At that time, she did not realize that she had been cut. She struggled with him and he backed off and went towards the utility room. She said she chased him and he went into the garage, and that's when she saw the knife on the floor of the utility room. So she picked it up and she placed it on the bar top, so her fingerprints would be on the handle of it. And she said she screamed for Darren and called 911. Detective Patterson asked her at this point to stop and kind of back up a little bit and remind him of what it was that the suspect was wearing. And Darlie said it was a black hat facing forward, and he had long straight brown hair, and it was kind of shoulder length, but that she couldn't see or describe anything about his face, but that she knew that he had on a black t-shirt, blue jeans, did not recall any tattoos or scars or like visible marks. But she said that he was on the taller side and was about Detective Frosch's height, which was about 6'2". He then asked, had she been sexually assaulted? And she said that she wasn't sure, so, she agreed to have a test done, and thankfully, that came back negative. The detective said that she did not cry during this discussion or mention the boys, except to say that they had been attacked. Now, he did ask her, if she and Darren had fought that evening, and she said they discussed the finances for just a few minutes. They kissed each other, said they loved each other, and then Darren took baby Drake upstairs to go to bed. So the detective then asked about Domino, and he was barking when she saw the attacker. And she said, well, come to think of it, no, he wasn't. And that was all the questions at that time. They left. But Darlie was super agitated after the interview and asked if she could please be given some Xanax to kind of calm down. Now, day shift nurses said Darlie would repeat her story many, many times, and it would shift a little bit slightly. She told one nurse named Jody Cotner that Damon had woke her up and saying, "Mommy." The nurse said Darren was in the room at the time that she was, kind of talking through this account, and so that he interjected, saying that must have been what he heard when he heard her and woke him up. Darlie said she saw the blood and she knew she was hurt, and she started toward the kitchen. Damon followed her, but she told him just to lay down. And she said that Darlie was detached, she's not crying, even when her mother and sister came to visit her in the room, and they were absolutely inconsolable. She also said when baby Drake came to visit that Darlie would not hold him or even touch sheets with him. Another nurse said that she heard Darlie and Darren going over the story and saying that the intruder had come in through the garage window, with Darren saying that he knew that he had locked that window, and Darlie saying that the boys must have been the ones who unlocked it. And this actually went on for so long that the nurse came in and stopped the conversation and said that Darlie needed to just focus on resting. Another nurse is going to go on later when we talk about the trial and testify that she had a lot of cuts on her fingers. And when asked how she got them, of course, Darlie said it was when she was trying to defend herself, obviously. But the doctors are going to say a different story. And they say they weren't deep enough, from their opinion, to be self-defense. Most likely they were self-inflicted. But of course, they can't say that with 100% certainty. Now, Darlie was released from the hospital on June 8th, and after being released, she repeated the story of that fateful night to her friends and her family. And it changes, as she's telling it. She says that she actually pushed Damon after he woke her up and said, "Wait for mommy." So little key facts, right? So more to come on that. But now let's take the attention off Darlie for a second, and let's focus on the facts surrounding the little boy's injuries. So Devin, he had a total of 4 wounds, 2 being to the chest, 1 being 5 inches deep and piercing his lung and pulmonary artery, and the other chest wound was 2.5 inches deep, and it actually pierced his liver. And Devin bled to death both internally and externally from these wounds. And the other 2 wounds were, one was to his left forearm, penetrating only the soft tissue, and the other was to the back of his left thigh. And he also had abrasions on his arms, palms, legs, and back. It's believed he was attacked in his sleep, and his abrasions were kind of part of your natural reaction. But it still begs the question of how he was injured to the back of the thigh if he wasn't trying to get away. So, maybe something we'll never know. But Damon had 4 wounds to his back. One was about 2 inches deep and pierced his left lung. The other one was 4.5 inches deep and pierced his right lung. Another was 2 inches and pierced the right lung again. And that 4th and final one was 3 inches deep, and it pierced his right lung, his diaphragm, and his liver. And he also had 2 wounds to his back. One was about 1/3 of an inch into his left shoulder muscle, and the other 3/4 of an inch into his upper left back. And Damon also had abrasions on his back, right arm, and both feet. But it's believed that he crawled from where he was asleep, vice where he was found when emergency workers got there. Darren said that Damon had fallen asleep kind of between the couch and the coffee table because he wanted to be close to his mama. And he was found near the entrance to the stairs, almost like he was trying to crawl towards the stairs. And his wounds are going to come up later again when we detail the trial. So, okay, that hurts my heart to talk about that. So when Darlie was released from the hospital on June 8th, the police took her down to the station for questioning, and Darren came as well. But when they kind of kept them apart, and they actually kept them for 3 or 4 hours, which made them late for the first viewing of their sons right before the funerals. So that was pretty traumatic, I would assume. And Darlie and Darren gave their first official statements during this time, talking about things like, well, we were making dinner, we were making popcorn, my sister was over there, but she wasn't feeling good, so Darren was going to drive her home, da-da-da-da. But Darlie does say that she told Darren that she was very depressed over that car situation. She didn't like being home without a car. Probably feeling isolated, right? And she said she was going to sleep on the couch that night because the baby just woke her up too much upstairs. She said Darren went to bed around 12:30 or 1 a.m. and she went to sleep shortly after. She was woken up when she felt the pressure on her right shoulder. She said it was Damon pressing on her right shoulder and he was crying, and that was when she saw a man standing at her feet. And she started walking after him, and she said she heard glass breaking, stopped to turn on the kitchen light, and that's when she saw that large white-handled knife lying on the floor of the utility room. She grabbed it and thought, the intruder was in the garage, so she shut the door, and she came back into the main part of the house and called for Darren. She put the knife on the counter, and when she looked at Darren, she said that she noticed at that point that the coffee table was knocked all the way over, and that flower arrangement that we talked about was not completely off. She said Darren ran down the stairs. She called 911. She said Darren started giving Devin CPR while she put a towel on her neck and then a towel on Damon's back. And she said she saw glass all over the kitchen floor. She went to the door. She started screaming for that neighbor, Karen, because Karen was a nurse. And this was all going on while she was on the phone with 911, according to her. And everything was just happening very, very quickly, which I'm sure that it was. She said she went back over to Damon and he had stopped moving, and that was about the time that the police came in. She said she remembered while paramedics were working on the children that she screamed, "Were her babies dead?" And Darren said yes. She said she showed Darren her neck, and he's the one that took her to the front porch. And then he went back inside and he got baby Drake and he brought him back downstairs, and Darren was the one that handed baby Drake to Karen. She said Darren wasn't allowed to go with her in the ambulance, and that she was told at the hospital that she needed surgery. And she remembers waking up from that surgery, and within just minutes, those detectives were in her room and asking her all kinds of questions. So this obviously varies greatly from the story she originally told, that she woke up and struggled and fought with the intruder, as well as the accounts from the paramedic and Officer Waddell saying that there was no towel on Damon. Now, Darren's official statement at this time was very much like his wife's. He said he woke up when he heard his wife screaming, "Devin, oh my God, Devin." He said he came downstairs, he slapped him trying to get a response out of Devin. He was trying to give him CPR, but that he could feel air coming out of his chest, and that he even tried to blow into the holes in his chest, and that, of course, didn't work. He said he saw Darlie on the phone and he ran over to Damon, and that he did not have a pulse, but he did see Damon's injuries right off the bat. He said the officers arrived and that he told them his boys had been attacked, and then he ran upstairs to put on his pants and check on the baby. He did not say that he brought baby Drake downstairs. Darren said then that he ran over to Karen's house since he didn't really know what to do, but he knew, Karen's a nurse, that she might be able to help in this situation. And he did say that he wanted to go to the hospital with Darlie, but officers made him stay for questioning. He said that he did tell the officers that Damon had no pulse. Now the families, they're already at the funeral home, right? They're waiting on Darlie and Darren to get there to start the viewing. So when police pull up, bring them and let them out. And they said, they all went inside, and when Darlie caught the first glimpse of those babies, that she just started screaming. Darlie's Aunt Sherry said it absolutely tore their hearts out, and that you could feel her pain. And the boys were buried in the same casket, and then Darren said it was because they died together, so they wanted to go to heaven together. And Darren even slipped pocket knives into their little shirt pockets because the boys had been wanting these for a while, but he hadn't gotten them for them when they were alive because he felt like they were too young. Now, Pastor David Rogers was the one in charge of the viewing, and he actually would officiate the funeral the next day on June 9th. And he spent some time with Darlie and the family for the next 3 or 4 days. And he would say that she was acting exactly how he had seen other grieving families behave. Now, the music she selected was Gangster's Paradise by Coolio, a song that the boys love to dance to, Jesus Loved Me, and I Will Always Love You, and that's what was played at the funeral. After that funeral, on June 10th, she had another interview with the police, and they photographed her injuries again, and now she's got this big old bruise that has surfaced on her arm. And the hospital says she did not have that during her initial stay, and doctors think it occurred on June 8th or 9th after she left the hospital. Fast forward to June 14th, and this is the Silly String incident. They held a graveside prayer service for the boys with just a few family members in attendance. And then right after that service, they held a small 7th birthday party for Devin because he would have turned 7 that day. Sherry said they already had all the party supplies anyway and were prepared, and Darlie said it was going to be something nice for the neighborhood kids who were grieving. And they, kids made cards and brought balloons. And Dana, Darlie's sister, brought silly string, handed it to Darlie. Darlie invited the press there, and she sprayed silly string everywhere. They're singing happy birthday and all these other party things. And when asked why, she told the press that she knew Devin and Damon. If you knew them, they were having the biggest party in heaven, and they would not want them to be sad right now, even though their hearts were breaking. And she and Darren were smiling during this interview. And when they asked how they felt about the whole incident, Darlie said they get sad, they cry, they even get sick, thinking this person is still out there doing whatever they wanted to do. While Darren, he said that, this investigation was definitely, they were bringing out the big guns, it's high tech, they were doing stuff he'd never even seen done in movies. And Darren and Darlie both said they were confident that the police would catch this killer. And she said she was in shock, and she was only thinking about saving her babies during the whole incident, and that she and Darren were trying to save them, but it was too late and the babies were gone. And Darren would say that he was hoping that the man had stolen something from their house or from them, and that was the reason that they were chosen, because they were living large and, somebody wanted to take something from them. But instead it was just a sick man who took the two most important things from them. But the whole interview was odd. But watch it for yourself and form your own opinion about it and see if you think it's odd or if you think it's just how someone would react. Because, again, everyone grieves differently. That is a true statement. Now, the problem with this interview, big problem, is going to be that Frosch and Patterson had actually placed a microphone in a nearby bush without the family's consent. But they did have the cemetery's consent. But it's going to come up in trial and be a big old problem, because they were trying to catch all the side conversations, too. Well, 4 days later, June 18th, while Darlie was at the police station for yet another interview, she was arrested formally on 2 counts of capital murder. The police department released a statement saying that they did not believe Darren was involved and that the crime scene told a very different story than what Darlie was saying. And that, my friends, is where we will break and wait for part 2. Now, this story is tough to hear and process, and part 2 is going to get you even more. But thinking about these 2 little boys and their lives stolen from them, regardless of who did it, it's just awful. They were innocent. This was a brutal and a heinous crime. And, we're going to cover the trial next time. But so far, what do y'all think? I mean, the trial gets as wild as the road that got us here. So just go ahead and get you a snack or a glass of wine ready because you're going to need it. But as always, thank you guys for being here. Don't forget to click that subscribe button and notification bell on your way out so that you will know when I post new content. And you guys stay safe out there and stay sweet and treat each other nicely in the comments, my cupcakes. I love you, and I will see you next time. Bye!